Welcome to our series in which we're exploring the future of work, particularly looking at it from the lens of independent workers, and also exploring the kind of future of the sharing economy, or what is called by some the sharing economy, and looking at essentially where the economy is going at large, the next iteration of our global economy here. I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of reInvent, the media company driving the series. And today we've got two fantastic folks here to talk deep about the big picture. We've got John Zysman, who's a professor of political science at UC Berkeley. And we've also got Martin Kenney, who's a professor in community and regional development at the University of California, Davis. And they both are working on the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy, which is a long-standing group that actually has been thinking through the fundamental changes that technology, globalization, and other big forces are driving and changing our economy today. So welcome to being here.
Great, thank you, Pete.
Well, you guys came up with a really interesting piece, a very influential and interesting piece called The Rise of the Platform Economy. And so the platform economy is kind of your phrasing of kind of these various ways we've been talking about this changing economy. So what might just be good is, for definition of terms, is what do you mean by the platform economy as we kind of tease out the story here a little bit?
Well, I think when you think about the platform economy versus the term sharing economy, so we think it's a lot larger. Amazon, Google, and Facebook are not sharing in the same way as people are referring to Uber and Airbnb.
Right.
So we like to think about it in a much broader sense of the term, because all of those are platforms. Alibaba, Tencent in China. I think if you look at it that way, you couldn't call those sharing. I mean, Google is an advertising-based firm, so we don't usually think of sharing that way, but a platform is what Google and Facebook create for an ecosystem of cooperators and people who are creating value on the platform.
Totally. So the lens you guys are putting on this, I just want to be clear from the beginning. So yeah, we are understanding, particularly when we think about the future of work, is definitely beyond the future of sharing. Future of sharing is kind of a subset that we're trying to understand in that kind of category, which we'll get to in a minute. But totally interested in this larger platform view that you're saying. So why don't we actually...
Let me jump in and add something.
Okay, go ahead.
Which really is, in addition to the issues about Google or Facebook and the like, we have to be clear that the prior step was the emergence of what we call the algorithmic revolution. In other words, the digitization of a whole array of products which began to find their functionality in the way in which the information that was embedded in them worked. In other words, you are John Deere and you're selling equipment for the farm, but what you're really selling is a tool that allows the soil to be analyzed as the plow is going through it. So that increasingly what we see with the development of algorithms driving the way in which products function and the emergence therefore of service sales, we start to, instead of just selling a tractor, you start to sell, or a jet engine, you start to sell how many hours in the air will the engine provide, which of course means that the seller of the engine is paying attention to the service in a new kind of way. So we go from selling products into selling services with this digitization. And algorithms increasingly end up running in the cloud, and that facilitates these elaborate systems which are platforms. And the platforms then permeate the entire economy, not just the narrow so-called sharing economy.
Okay, that's a good way. So you guys are pulling the lens back. So let's actually do that again, given your Berkeley Roundtable for the Berkeley Roundtable for the International Economy. So maybe the better way to do it, because give us that bigger perspective, is, and give our kind of context for our conversation, is talk about how this economy that everyone is very familiar with in the 20th century, how it's evolved, and you've kind of started to touch on those changes to get us to this platform economy. Like, explain a little bit more of the drivers to get us to here, and then what we're going to do through the course of the conversation is then also look at where it could go. So explain to someone outside the field here to kind of where you guys see that 20th century economy starting to shift. You mentioned the digital kind of emergence here, globalization, and others. I'm just kind of curious. So give us the larger context of what got us to here.
Well, in some sense, what we were talking about in the late 20th century was the emergence of a services economy. But a services economy isn't just about selling medical services or selling accounting services. It is this transformation of many products into service sales. If you happen to be selling cranes, and this is a real instance, if you happen to be selling cranes and you're a Finnish company and you're facing Chinese competition, Chinese will make the crane perhaps less expensively, but if you can embed all of your port equipment for cranes into one operating system, you can say, well, buy our equipment, we'll run your port for you. We'll sell you port management services in which all of this equipment is embedded, so that it begins to be a services economy in which the objects are rooted. That's the emergence of the Internet of Things. That's the emergence of the platform, which partly is about matching different kinds of activities. So the platforms, in a sense, facilitate the Internet of Things. The Internet facilitate these kinds of matching things, such as Airbnb or Uber and the like.
So you had a kind of economy that was a 20th century economy, industrial economy. You see it evolving more and more to services, and then we layered on
ICT-enabled services.
Okay, so then you start getting the I guess the internet-enabled, computerized-enabled, ICT-enabled services, and then you keep seeing you guys talk about big data. I mean, just tell us what are the disruptors that were taking that old economy and giving it these new capabilities in some ways, or these new kind of disruptive forces.
Mark? Well, you know, when you start looking at this shift toward ICT-enabled services, I mean, we call it services with everything. You know, in fact, that's when all the data starts to come in, because big data is partly about your marketplace. I mean, who's buying what, all the information you can potentially get about your customers from their behavior, but it's also about all the objects. So you're running jet engines. I mean, the jet engines are streaming data, and you know, how do you redesign the engine? How do you handle maintenance? All of that is about the analytics of these huge sets of data sources. So the AI story, deep learning, all of that sort of grows incrementally as we moved into these services with everything, of which then the platform economy is sort of the next big phase with that. In some sense, globalization, which we've all looked at quite carefully, right, watched the fragmentation of production and the movement of production all around the world. And as it did that, it meant that for an enormous array of the component elements, everybody could make them. The information was there, and so the Chinese make them after the Koreans have made them, and therefore it becomes price-based competition. So if you want to escape price-based competition, you have to figure out how do you change the way in which value is created. And you start to do that by ICT-enabled kind of provision of services, or ICT-enabled analytics of the way in which those products are behaving. So both the platform economy is much broader than just a handful of personal consumption services sectors, and much broader than advertising sectors. It's pervasive throughout the economy. We probably should say something about why we're skeptical of the phrase sharing.
I think absolutely we should say that. I think what John is pointing to in particular is the manufacturing sector, and the manufacturing, or the if you want, B2B kind of sectors. There's this other huge sector which I think we've been focusing on, and one that is more visible to us, which is the consumer side. You and I use Google, you and I use Facebook, we all use Uber, Airbnb. And those are the platforms that I think are the most visible now. I think what John is talking about is something that's happening in the manufacturing and logistics space, in the B2B, where there are firms, and that's also digitizing. So the bigger picture is everything is digitizing, everything is producing data, right? And the question is who's going to be there to extract the value from that data. Will it be GE's engine, or will it be someone like Google coming in over the top with its digital capabilities? Will GE have those capabilities? Will Google have those capabilities? Who will have those capabilities? We see it today in a manufacturing sector, which is automobiles. Automobile industry is being transformed by data in many, many different ways. The supply chain is becoming more visible. We're going from 3D software to 3D printing. Well, what will be printed? Will it be the prototype? But that's all driven by data. Maps. Who will control the maps? Will it be the Germans? Or be Google? If you're moving towards an autonomous car, what is one of the key aspects of that? A map, right? Maps, right? So who comes in over the top, right? Could it be Google? That's why the Germans bought Nokia Maps. The German auto industry got together to buy Nokia Maps. If we look in another sector, look at Amazon, what Amazon is doing to the distribution system, right? As it has its own automobiles, its own delivery, its own, it contracts to delivers like FedEx or UPS. It has its own air fleet, but of course it also contracts, has its own warehouses and contracts. It's making the supply chain more visible. So these are the kinds of concerns, and it's very hard to see all the vectors of change because digitization is in some ways insidious, right? It's coming in every aspect of social and economic life. When you look at your cameras here, all digital now. It's kind of insidious, but that's changing the way you do interviews now, the way you cut an interview, right? So I think that if we think about it that way, then what John is talking about is this sort of big wave is coming across almost everything, and therefore, who has the algorithms, who has the data, and who can extract value from those data starts to shift power. If Google has the maps and the auto industry doesn't, well, where's the power as we move more and more towards autonomy? Like when we think about it that way, we can start to see the implications of this that go, I think, far beyond, let's say, sharing, Uber, sharing some cars. And Uber, of course, is also impacting the auto industry. But we have to see it that way to start to think about what is the world of work, the world of competition, going to be in the next 20 years versus, as you said, the end of the last century.
Fascinating. I love that perspective. Oh, sorry, you want to jump in there?
Yeah.
Let's explore the sharing distinction, which I think is a good one. We want to flush that, but I love where you guys have gotten this conversation to, because it's really, you're describing like a world historical almost kind of transformation of the global economy.
Which it is.
Okay, well this is so this is like so go ahead. You were going to jump in.
I was going to say a couple of quick comments on the so-called sharing economy,
okay,
and then refixing the discussion on work.
Okay, and on the bigger picture.
And on the bigger picture. The comment about sharing is that I'm not quite sure that it's anything other than an advertising branding element, because my question in many business conferences when I speak is, if this is a sharing economy, can I share your jets over the weekend? Who's sharing what with whom? What it really is a commercialization of personal goods in some cases, and their transformation into capital goods on the one hand, whether it's Uber or it's Airbnb. And it raises a whole range of questions of whether or not we're moving backwards into sort of a semi-feudal kind of economy rather than forward into something that's quite modern. So very little of this is really sharing. Much of it is a set of matchmaking taking place on a platform in which personal goods are converted into commercial goods.
So what you say about the sharing is, even though those personal goods are being, you're sharing the bedroom with somebody else, you're saying sharing, you're taking sharing as that you can't make money off the share or something like that? Or
I think when you think about sharing, if I say I'm going to share a cup of coffee with you, and that will cost you $1.50, you might say, well, Martin's selling me the coffee, he's not sharing the coffee with me. So So
yeah.
there's a kind of an ideological component to it. Now, if we use Wikipedia as an example, that's very close to sharing, right? We give a donation, and it truly is a voluntary donation, to the Wikipedia Foundation that creates this knowledge base, of course, bigger than any encyclopedia, et cetera, that we can all share, right? Or the open source software movement. I create some software, I put it in a repository, you can take it out, and you can put in more, you can improve it and put it back. To us, that is sharing, and that's very powerful, right? That's another model. So one could think of, instead of Uber, one could think of a national taxi cooperative, and the French are starting to experiment with that. Well, there, the return comes back to the cooperative. That tends to be more in the normal English language term of sharing. But if I rent you for a night my room, you can call it sharing if you want, but I will collect the money from you, right? The platform makes this matching possible, but Uber is not doing, well, they may be doing it for free, they're losing so much money, but they intend at some point to make it into a profit-making enterprise. You, as the person renting out your room, are doing this for income, and I'm doing it because it's cheaper than the hotel or more convenient.
So here's one thing. I totally get what you're saying, and others have kind of raised this, but is there a way to think, so your larger platform economy thing, which includes, like you say, Google and all kinds of transactions, is there a way to think separately of a part of that platform economy that is dealing in shared assets, let's just put it that way, as opposed, which is different than a gig economy that's a purely labor-oriented thing, which there's no assets that are being exchanged, being used, that kind of thing.
I think you've touched on it, which is this. So the platform economy implies that there are a series of segments that are quite different. There may be something which is consumer related. There are those that are business related. There are those that are labor market related. I mean, because whether or not the gig economy is bigger than it ever was, or whether it's just operating on different terms, is an open question. But in fact, if we take the platform economy, we aren't locked into one narrow segment of this transformation. And I think that becomes an easy way of moving over into the question of what are the consequences for work, because some portion of this discussion is focused on the gig economy and the rules, labor market rules and social policy rules, where in fact it's legitimate and important questions. That is, what protects the workforce, what protects the consumer in that kind of a gig economy? Should drivers of cars be under some kind of regulation, whether they're actually taxi drivers or not? But there's a separate set of questions which may, in the long run, be more powerful, which is, how does automation, AI-based automation, what we call computation-intensive automation, intelligent tools, intelligent systems, actually transform the character of work? I mean, because in fact, the problem at a General Motors factory is not about gig workers, it's how many workers are there on the shop floor and how many robots. So the question that's now come up is, how does that transform the structure of work more broadly? Now, if I can continue for a moment, I would say that from the advanced countries like the United States, the German story of what is now called Industry 4.0, which you may have heard of. Industry 4.0 is a self-conscious effort by the German business community, government, and unions to say, there is a wave of automation sweeping across. It's going to transform the way work is operated. How do we maintain skill-based employment? Because the thing the Germans sell is either in the form of very sophisticated cars or very sophisticated production equipment. They're selling embodied skills. So that in fact, if automation wipes away an advantage for skilled workforces, the Germans, the Finns, the Danes have nothing, right? So Industry 4.0 is the self-conscious effort to try and address that. And it really comes through partly an automation-based story. Now, who wrote the report, which is a government report? The head of the AI Institute in Germany, the former head of SAP, the CEO, Henning Kagermann, a couple of people who were out of Siemens and so forth. So it's, for the most part, a large business, large union effort to try and begin addressing that question. And that's part of what really fascinates us in this story, is this broad sweep, as you're saying. It's not just the narrow gig workers or the like. It's, from a policy standpoint, how do we make sure that we augment skills rather than just destroy skills? How do we try and assure that these kinds of transformations allow the creation of new kinds of jobs, not just the transformation and elimination of old jobs?
Totally interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think, so again, it's back to the wide variety of vectors of change. So John is speaking about really a vector of change that's close to the shop floor. There are other vectors of change that are much higher up. So look at Amazon. Amazon is having a very severe impact on retail, as you know. Mm-hmm. So the jobs there will start to be switched. They will be switched from a retail worker, let's say in the Abercrombie and Fitch store, to a warehouse worker, right? So you're actually going to see the geography of jobs and the type of jobs. So one could imagine, well, it's hard to say right now, but we're seeing a lot of retail bankruptcies in the United States. One could imagine the number of retail workers dropping and the number of warehouse workers increasing. I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think economists, labor economists, et cetera, are going to have to be cognizant of as that particular shift occurs. So there's going to be a shift, we believe, in retail warehousing and what the balance is there as we order more and more online, right? And we can see this perhaps even more in China, where China's percentage of all retail sales is now about 25% is through the internet in some way, through the smartphone, really, through the WeChat or Alipay. The United States is about 9%, 8% of all retail sales are through the internet, but that's going at about 0.5%, 0.75% a year. That's been increasing. So I think that what's so interesting about this phenomenon is that it is at so many levels. For the Germans, another concern for the Germans is the over-the-top platforms coming out of the United States and platformizing whole parts of work and making, the machine, this is an exaggeration, the machine into like your smartphone, downloading apps, right? Well, then where is the power? Who controls the power in that machinery supply chain and that machinery operations? Right? So John gave the example of the port. Well, the port is, since the Finnish firm is trying to create a platform, but who in the end will control that platform? Who will be over the top, right? As the operators have found out, to their dismay, Apple came in over the top of them. Google and Android came in over the top. The walled gardens of the operators are gone. The telecom operators.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I'm just again for the sake of those watching this so you're describing a really epic transformation here. I mean, there's the globalization in the service development. There's the digital technologies rippling through everything. There's the manufacturing to service shifting. There's the platforms emerging and coming in. So you guys, particularly you, I know coming out of political science. I mean, so there's essentially a power shift going on here. There's a reorganization of all this. Give us some guidance on how you're thinking about this whole thing in terms of, okay, we're bought into this transformation. We understand the disruption going on here. What are some of these choices that we're facing here, and what are some of the kind of decision points we got to start thinking about?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the data that we have about what's actually going on is very weak. And the reason it's very weak is what are our categories? If you actually wash a window for General Motors, you're a manufacturing employee. If General Motors hires ISS, which is a global services firm that manages buildings for major corporations around the world, and you wash windows for them, you're a services employee. If you're in fact working in a warehouse for Walmart, you're a retail employee. If you in fact are working in a warehouse for Amazon, you're probably a warehouse employee. Equally important, the skills required in the Amazon warehouse are completely different. I don't know if you've ever worked in a warehouse. I have. And when I was a kid, I worked in a warehouse, and you pick things up and you move them. And now you probably have to have some software competence to be able to know how to operate in tandem. And that the whole point of what Ken Goldberg, our colleague, would say, which is multiplicity. What is the link between what people do and what robots do? So that's one question. How do we actually know what's going on? It's very difficult to do. The second, as Martin is saying, is most of the old-fashioned rules about this, are no longer easily applicable. The old reality that it's embedded in what's embedded in code is the law, rather than what's necessarily written down in the law books. So, in a whole array of domains, intellectual property, or property. If I own a car, I can do what I want with it, right? If I have a modern car in 15 years and all of its operating systems are controlled by Tesla or someone else, and they tell me what I can and can't do with the car because I'm violating intellectual property rules if I try and fix it, that's actually come up now in agricultural equipment, in which some of the ag equipment companies are saying to the farmers, you can't touch what we're doing. You can't touch our seeds, you can't touch our equipment. So the question of where intellectual property blurs into property, and it's no longer possible to simply, in a book we did called How Revolutionary Was the Digital Revolution, one of the comments, of course, is it's not possible to simply declare that the old rules apply in the new world, because if you just say that, nothing works. What competition policy, is what the meaning of what are the markets, the meaning of what is power, begin to shift rather dramatically. And at the moment,
in terms of when you say competition policy, meaning what's a
antitrust,
monopoly,
antitrust.
antitrust.
Sorry, the European version of that is competition policy. We call it antitrust. And a lot of the interesting debates at the moment are not happening in the United States, partly for political reasons as to who's in power, partly the way we set up the questions. They're really taking place in Europe, and in part because it's a European response to, as Martin was saying, to the very powerful American platform companies. So competition policy is at issue, and it's overt. That is, Margaret Vestager, who's the commissioner for competition policy, is quite clear that this whole thing needs to be rethought. But as many commentators say, we have no tools. Economists don't have effective tools for even beginning to structure that debate.
We don't even have taxonomies. To start to understand at what level is the competition, right? So we see, I use Amazon. What did we see? Walmart is just hooking up with Google, right? As obvious response to what's happening to them, right? So you're starting to see that there's a blurring of lines. Amazon is competing with Walmart, but now maybe Amazon is competing with Walmart, Google, Alliance, sorry, with an alliance. So you're starting to see very interesting couplings. Is Google a competitor in the auto industry? What if Amazon decides it wants to be an auto dealer? Well, now Amazon is competing with the auto dealers. So we're seeing these very odd alliances and competitions emerging, not from the normal vectors, right? GM competed with Ford, and then they found out they were competing with Toyota. But are we competing with Google? And what does that mean?
I mean, and one of the interesting questions that I think comes out of that is that, and part of the issue of the sharing, back to the sharing economy, is that companies like Uber say, You know, we're not a transport company, we're a tech company. So you should not regulate us as a transport company. So one of the questions, and it's clear as day, this will be a real fight, is do we treat companies that are providing the platforms as neutral tech companies, or if they intrude or begin doing business in a particular domain, such as transport, do we treat them and say, fine, your competitive advantage is the quality of your platform, but you're now a transport company, so you have to, in fact, obey the rules of transport companies. New York City has now done that, in effect.
Do you think that is effectively, or do you think there's a third way, that there's some new era of rules or new next generation of rules?
I think that's the question. We're going to see, we see this question of the tech companies saying we're only tech companies, and the transport companies like taxi companies saying, no, you're not, you're transport companies. And then your question of do we see some kind of more sensible evolution of how the rulemaking should work, evolve? That's an open question, I think.
What do you guys think about that, though? I'd be curious.
Well,
Do you think there needs to be some next thing, or?
So let's give, I mean, take that example in another direction. Today, Airbnb allows you to rent someone's room, share or rent someone's room for the night. In the hotel industry, you can't discriminate, right? Because the state will say, you know, if you discriminate, you say, I don't want a person because of color, whatever. The state will come in and say, you have to do it, and you know, we'll shut you down. On Airbnb, it becomes much harder to enforce those rules, and the state is not enforcing those rules. It's Airbnb. But that's moved, you know, discrimination policy in the largest room renting chain or operation in the world. It's moved it to the private sphere. So again, what is the state going to do? Is the state going to decide that Airbnb is a kind of a hotel chain and has to follow the same rules about non-discrimination, et cetera, that you as a public lodging, which is what a hotel is, facility operation, right? So these are the kinds of things, this is a very stark vignette, but I think these are the kinds of things that we will have to, we as the globe, right, because Airbnb is a global firm, have to start thinking about. And what are those rules? Are those rules different in different places? Or we'll give one other example, is that 25 years ago, when you decided on a hotel in Europe, you looked at the stars. And those were a government usually, or some sort of quasi-government administrator who gave stars on the basis of a set of criteria. Today, when you rent a hotel on TripAdvisor, do you look at how many stars was given by the Italian government to this hotel? No. You look at the comment section. That's become a new regulatory system.
But not necessarily better or worse, but you're just saying different.
Different.
Yeah.
Let me follow up on this, because I think it is, when you ask about policy and where it's going to go, we're seeing in real time, i.e. this week, a fight emerging that will shape how the Ubers and the like are actually handled, which is London has banned Uber this week.
I did see that, yeah.
You know, now they've banned them, saying that they aren't a trustworthy transport partner. They're more than a tech company, they're a transport partner. Now Uber is gonna fight back and try and say, well, we're not that. Lyft has now come and said, well, maybe we'll expand into London. Okay, now the question is, will Lyft sit down, of course it will, with the London authorities and say, what are your concerns? How do we actually handle this and manage it? Now, just for everyone to understand, I mean, the struggle in England between Uber-like vehicles and the taxis is the struggle between the black car and what used to be the independent sort of little cars that ran around and phoned to get help, because black cars are very expensive. And the black taxis, in fact, have their own platform now and have a whole set of ways of, as Martin was saying, of changing the costing structures to be able to compete with Uber. And so some of it will take place in the marketplace, and some of it will take place as these things are fought out. Will a model that emerges out of London be a reference point for a discussion in France? Yes, though in France, of course, the issue is that the taxi drivers who own medallions own these medallions, and it's their lifetime investment. So that in fact, if the medallions lose value, you're really creating social damage to one part of the community. The Uber drivers, and Lyft's not in Paris, the Uber drivers, in fact, are from the suburbs. They're the minority kids who can't get other kinds of jobs. And in many cases, with Uber's help, are renting cars. So you have this enormous social struggle between established drivers who, it's not white versus immigrant. It's an earlier generation of immigrants in many cases versus this. And it's quite messy, and therefore part of it will be settled in the market and should be, and part of it will be fought out appropriately as a set of policy issues, which makes it all very interesting.
I was going to say, we're describing this ferment of kind of
It's a ferment.
crazy. I mean,
It's
this
a
is
ferment.
what this whole series has been. Is like, it's just amazing how much is happening so fast and playing itself out. So give us. So you're observers, relatively neutral observers, because you've been very judicious in how you describe these things. But give us some guidance on what are some ways forward that would be constructive? And think of it as, I mean, what could the platforms do? What could governments do? What could workers themselves do? I mean, are there some ways that you've been thinking about that would be ways forward for this platform economy beyond some of the foundational stuff you've been talking about here?
We should probably each take a shot at it. No. Well, I think the first thing is when and where we should treat platform companies as agents in particular domains, such as transport or hotels and so forth. That should be an open, straightforward debate. There isn't an automatic answer in any of these, and it will vary in different places. A second issue is quite clearly what are the appropriate rules in competition policy in this era. And that has to be broadened out. One quick comment is there's a huge difference between the American definitions of what is antitrust policy and the basis for action, and the European definitions of what is competition policy in dominant firms. Oversimplified, and it's very relevant, is the American focus is Chicago school based on consumer welfare, but consumer welfare today.
Explain that to someone who's
consumer welfare means how much benefit does the consumer get out of the current arrangement.
Usually based on cost, right?
Usually
Price.
based on cost or price, but without a lot of attention to where that may evolve to. In other words, if you have a single dominant firm, we may well get benefit today, but it may block an array of things tomorrow. So the analysis in the American case is what one would call static today, as opposed to dynamic. How is this going to unfold over time? The European analysis has two other considerations, one of which is what is the dynamic consequence of this? In other words, if a company, in fact, has a dominant position today, how can it exploit that position over time? That was part of the answer to IBM. It was part of the concern about Microsoft. And it's part of why the U.S., it's not just American companies versus European companies, though it is partly that. It is there's a different vantage on this. And there's another twist, which is the Europeans built in, whether they always say it aloud or not, sometimes it's said aloud, are equally concerned about the political consequences of a handful of dominant players. Whereas that's absolutely excluded from the analysis in the American side. If you have a dominant player today, can it reshape the rules so that in fact it wins tomorrow in a way that may be less good for the consumers, or which may be less good for democracy? Okay, and it's not just politics versus economics. It is, if I can, look, if we could all sit down and conspire and decide what the rules are on taxis over the next couple of years, not tell anybody and fix it, we'd know where to invest. We'd all make a great deal of money. Okay, so the question becomes that. So competition policy it cannot be just classic, a bunch of economists sitting around and thinking about this. And the last area that I really believe in very deeply is, can we start to encourage the understanding of what kind of deployments of intelligent tools and systems support skills. Much of that is a story of user interfaces. Let me give you an example. I don't know whether, I mean, you come out of the old school of tech stuff, so it's possible, but I don't know whether you ever programmed a document in Unix 4.2. You know, for those who don't know, Unix 4.2 is the underlying operating system for much of Apple product today. Actually, there was no user interface. You know, there was basically, you either knew how to run that system as an operating system to get a document out. We once had to get a document out and to Washington or have a lawsuit. And we were all up all night trying to get Unix 4.2 to print the document. The user interface is called Word, right? It's called Microsoft Office. So Microsoft Office transforms this enormously powerful supercomputer into something that allows nincompoops like me, who really can't control the underlying system, to basically be able to do a whole array of things. Obviously, Microsoft Office, it was accounting systems, it was word processing systems. So that applies across the economy. That is, if we want skilled workers, we bring people who have skills, therefore other kinds of skills come into play. And the extent to which we are able to support the development of complementary skills is user interfaces. So those would be the three big areas that I would highlight.
And your third one being really more related to workers. That's
right. Because the gig economy is just is in the long run going to be a secondary issue. It matters a lot. It matters we get the right social policies and labor market policies. But if we destroy work and we destroy skills, you know, it's not.
So you're saying the current, just to finish that, and I'd love to get to you here, Martin. But so you're saying the gig economy is kind of a temporary way to. It's just waiting till we figure out the next system that'll actually work for workers.
It's an element of the story.
Yeah,
but
of the current story.
Of the current story. And it will always be an important part of the story. But really, over the long run, you know, what kind of skilled jobs do we actually have? How do we actually use these technologies to try and support the, draw on the skills and talents of the workforce?
That's the key. Any thoughts on those? Again, we're kind of trying to figure out where's the way forward. What are the places we start figuring this out?
John and I disagree a little bit on this, but
is that possible?
Yeah, we don't disagree that there's a distributional problem already. We don't disagree that the trajectory of this distribution is likely, if it doesn't change, to continue to create more inequality, not less inequality. And so I think one of the things the states are going to have to think about is how are we going to handle distribution, particularly in situations where increasingly those who own and control the platform are able to extract value. Google, Facebook, I mean, you know, they are extracting value from the overall society, and they're capturing it in capital gains, the stock market, et cetera. So we're creating, you know, wealth for capital and for these very successful entrepreneurs and their employees. I mean, if you're an employee of Google or Facebook, you are benefiting, and that's wonderful. We want people to be successful in our society, but how are we going to ensure that if there are losers, there's going to be some sort of redistribution to them? Now, I agree with John, there will be more, and we need to figure out ways to have more skilled labor where those skilled workers can continue to have middle-class lifestyles. And I think that's, as John said earlier, one of the issues that the Germans and our Nordic friends are thinking about as they start to think about if their society changes if computation-intensive automation takes over, how are those workers going to be kept in the middle class as workers and not just be expelled from the workforce and become unemployed? So for all of the countries, we are going to have to think about this redistribution, because if there's no way of redistributing, then we could get an increasing inequality and the social tensions that come with it, and that all of the advanced developed countries are seeing in the political system today is there are losers, and the losers are not happy. So is that redistribution going to be UBI? Or is it
Universal
basic
income?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it going to be something else? Is it going to be increase of the minimum wage? I mean, how are we going to handle this? Because when I see computation-intensive automation, when I see these platforms, I see inequality potentially continuing to increase. It is increasing across the European countries, which actually think about trying to keep it under control. It's certainly increasing in our country, where we haven't been as interested in ensuring that income inequality doesn't increase.
Can I add on that? Because there's one of the debates in the economic literature is the extent to which the new technologies generate low skill jobs and very high skill and income jobs and eat out the middle. You know, now the reality is that the answer is, even in the short run, very different country by country. So that suggests that the way in which the tools are deployed and the policies within which, and the national context within which they're deployed, shapes those outcomes. So one of the questions is clearly, can we limit the damage, if you will, of these technologies? And equally important, as Martin is suggesting, is how are the distributional consequences handled, because if they're not, then there are political economic consequences. Can I add one element, which is one way of thinking about this is, and you asked the question, which policies? One can't really think about this policy by policy. What one really has to do is say, what is the economic and political bargain which in fact allows marketplaces to create and generate economic value and distribute it in ways that allow social stability and political stability. And the question then becomes, how are these packages of policies actually orchestrated? As Martin's saying, the Europeans are self-conscious about that. And one way of asking this is, after World War II, we saw very rapid growth in many countries, and we can articulate clearly what the deals were. Some of the deals were social bargains. Some of the deals were let the markets work their way and screw the losers. And some of the strategies, particularly in Japan and France, were beat up on the losers and make sure that they don't get in the way of the economic growth. But there are clearly these packages, if you will, these economic, political economy strategies. And we need to be asking, what kinds do we need now that allow both economic growth and social stability? Because in fact, just getting economic growth at this point is not going to also assure the kind of social stability on which solid democratic institutions will endure.
Let me just add, I think that in this situation with computation and machine learning and all of that, the turbulence is very high. And it's very hard to figure out what the coalitions and alliances will be and how they will come together in periods of extremely high turbulence, of change on many vectors, as I described in the auto industry. There's so many vectors hitting them from different directions. So this argues for some, certainly a higher level discussion of what kind of policies can you develop with extreme turbulence and an inability to exactly see what the future is. So I mean, if we take the EU's regulations and attempts to control IBM or Microsoft, it isn't those regulations that overthrew IBM or today are putting Microsoft's position in question. I mean, Microsoft is no longer so dominant in the ICT space, which of course overarches so many things, as it was 15 years ago. 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, it would be hard to have said, I think Google will give them a run for the money. Mm-hmm. And so this I think is one of the difficulties that the Europeans have, is that they want to regulate, and I think they should. I think that what they're doing is raising the questions, but it actually, in some sense, Google and Microsoft also have a position which is, we can be overthrown much more quickly than GM was overthrown. GM, ran this country, GM was America, or America was GM, for 50, 60 years. I mean, Microsoft is, it's now about 36 years old, but you wouldn't today say Microsoft is absolutely a dominant corporation in ICT. I think these are some of the issues that make it very hard to regulate, very hard to think through what does one do to control these very powerful firms.
Well, okay, so you're I loved your analogy here to post-World War II. So let's just play this out a couple of ways, because there's two pieces there. In fact, we're doing a big event here, which we can talk later. I'd love to have you guys involved if you want, on comparing what was the Treaty of Detroit, the deal between the auto industry and the labor, to what could be a Treaty of San Francisco or something. We're thinking about it out here. So what could be done within the the companies or the economies or the industries themselves? And then the second piece is, as we know in the post-war world, Europe had its own way of dealing with providing healthcare and all these things for the workers of the future, and the U.S. had its own company-based thing, which was related to that Treaty of Detroit. I'm just curious if you. What could be done in each of those spheres? Because you mentioned regulation, we should talk about that, but also what could these platform companies or the industry itself potentially do to head off or to kind of deal with some of these building pressures? I'm curious, any thoughts on that?
Yes, but I think we've started sketching them out.
No, totally we have. I'm just trying to keep
the question
moving.
That's difficult.
Yeah.
The question that's difficult is, what was it that allowed there to be a Treaty of Detroit, i.e. one labeled by a city and a single company, or set of companies? And what is it in the case of San Francisco? So the question was, what was the national context that meant a handful of companies could in fact set the dominant set of rules about how companies would deal with their workforces, and which meant the advantages that those companies had, which was an oligopoly that extracted value from all the rest of us in the absence of external competition, and could be passed to their workforces in the form of pensions and health services, didn't have to be extended to the rest of the community, right? I mean, that's because any Treaty of Detroit, that is the bargain, right? And it's cut off from the rest of the national story. So what is the context? The reason I'm saying what's hard is to think through now, many of these issues cannot be settled at a San Francisco or a California level. What's more easily understood at California level is energy and climate policy. I mean, in other words, I can see ways in which we drive a treaty. We have a set of treaties of California, which are intended to try and drive the directions of energy policy in this country, one of which is to allow non-fossil fuels to emerge rapidly enough and their costs to drop far enough that we allow coal and oil to be undercut on a pure price basis in the market. There are a set of other kinds of issues. It's much harder since the issues we've mentioned are competition policy, labor market policy outside of the regulation of cities, by cities, of Ubers and Airbnbs, competition policy, social policy, much of which is at the national level. Do we have Obamacare, or do we have something else, and so forth? So many of those intellectual property issues, that's why I'm thinking, we think of what is a national deal. I think it's easier for me to think about a national deal at this point than it is a pure city deal, and that's interesting. Okay.
What's interesting?
It's interesting that
international?
you could have a Detroit deal,
Oh, I see.
and very sensibly, as you're doing, referring to it, and that it's much harder in these domains to think about a San Francisco deal. And so part of the question for me then becomes what's different between climate and energy, where I can imagine it, remember it's off the top of our head,
Yeah.
and information technology and work, where I find a harder time imagining it instantly. I mean, those are very interesting questions.
I mean,
Bravo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think when one thinks of the Detroit deal, one thinks of also a labor force that is in manufacturing. Detroit obviously ripples out to coal and steel, because there is a Detroit deal because it's the UAW, but there's the steel workers, the coal workers, et cetera, in the 1930s that are putting together this deal, and they're striking against their corporation, their factory, their corporation. In this labor market, right, you have the Google employees, the platform employees are very well treated. They may strike, but they're probably unlikely to. And then you have the gig workers, all of these other employment relationships. It's a zoo. Today, the United States is a zoo of employment relationships. Uber is a kind of a employment relationship, if you want. There's, individual contractors. There's firms that will deliver contractors to you, Upwork, et cetera, from around the world. So the ability of a class of workers to become the key fulcrum, big labor, big manufacturing, right? That was the fulcrum of the Detroit deal. We don't have on this side a very clear set of workers that could organize and would have enough power to exert muscle against, in this case, big business, big capital, whichever term you would like to use.
But could big business or big capital not be forced a hand in the old kind of head-to-head battle, or could there be more in looking for their own long-term good, avoiding backlash, avoiding the pitchforks at some level? Could you imagine some kind of deal still struck, even though the labor isn't as well organized?
That's something to pursue.
Yeah.
And the question is, deal with whom is part of the question.
Yeah, that's
but
good.
before we run out of time, the
Yeah.
one domain we haven't mentioned, which we should, and which we if we redo this, as it were, which is what happens in education policy. Because when I say user interfaces are the corporate side of this, the training side of this is a matter of how do we make sure that the broader community and workforces are educated in ways that allow them to effectively use these tools. And to be blunt, we don't know. And the reason I say we don't know is because the standard answer over the last century has been extend the number of years of schooling. First, we insisted that people have a grade school education so they could at least read and write. Then we insisted that they have a high school education, which is they could do different kinds of things, and maybe have enough algebra that they could understand the relationship between different things that are happening, because that's what algebra and math is ultimately about. And now, in fact, it's not obvious that simply adding the number of years to schooling actually what it adds. So the question is, reorganizing an educational system is very difficult. So what does it need to consist of? What needs to be taught? One is what needs to be taught, and two, what are the resources we're willing to put into it? Because as part of the California bargain, the reality that we've gone from funding public schools at a uniquely high level when I first arrived out here and started teaching at Berkeley, and I'm professor emeritus now, by the way, so it was 4,000 years ago in the age of the dinosaurs. And now when California is at the bottom near the bottom of the public funding of schools, are we surprised that we get bad outcomes? Are we surprised in terms of secondary school and primary school educational outcomes? Are we surprised that the schooling system is at the university level is under pressure? That's a crucial element. So from the question becomes, what kind of skills do we need? What kind of education do we need? And how do we do it? Since reorganizing an existing system, which is the education system, is always harder than just adding. When you decide you're going to extend high school, everybody wants to do it because they're new jobs. There are a whole range of benefits now. So should Martin and I have to go back and learn new sets of skills to be able to do certain kinds of distance teaching? I think given our backgrounds, probably not a big deal. But in fact, for a whole array of people, of course it is. So how do we think through that whole education problem? Funding and what's in it.
I think the final point that I'd like to bring up is that the Europeans are unfortunately, they have Skype and Spotify, but in this space, they are not very competitive. But China is a bit different. China has some very serious platform firms. They have the same kinds of digital problems in size and scale, perhaps not the scale of Google, not the scale of Facebook, but very big problems of 20 million cell phones going on at the same time in Beijing, right? I mean, these are big data problems. So they're dealing with these problems. They're developing payment systems that are quite different from the United States and that may not be scalable into the United States. They may or may not be, but certainly may be into the rest of the world, outside of the developed countries. And the rest of the world is becoming bigger and bigger. If you look at the share of global GDP, rest of world is becoming bigger, is becoming a larger and larger percentage compared to the US, Japan, and Western Europe. So these are some issues that may come up in the future of a global competition between two very different models, the Silicon Valley model of digital platforms and the Chinese model. So I think that's going to be very interesting. And if you go to China in payment systems, they're far ahead of us. It's just for sure. Everybody knows this, right? WeChat makes Facebook, WhatsApp, the Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram amalgamation look relatively unsophisticated. So that's another sort of twist in this. If the Chinese, and it's not guaranteed, that the Chinese can escape the Chinese market and start to compete globally. And of course, in Southeast Asia, we're already seeing the Chinese models, the Chinese firms becoming competitive. And the Chinese firms are very intent upon becoming global players and not just becoming China players.
But do you guys, with your bird's eye view of the whole global economy, is that a good thing you're saying? So that's kind of throwing a counterbalance to the Silicon Valley venture model. I mean, it's interesting. I'm curious.
It's just a thing.
It's a thing. It's easy to.
We'll find out whether we respond to it. But from a standpoint of where America gets caught in a pincer,
Okay. Yeah, talk about
the
that.
problem is, I mean, if China actually succeeds, and it may not, because the Japanese ended up as a system with leaders without followers. They were big successes internally and couldn't export some of the mobile stuff. And the Europeans are real leaders in manufacturing technologies, which is what happened to machine tools and NC machine tools a generation ago, where the American NC machine tool were destroyed from one end by simpler but sophisticated tools from Japan and very complex and sophisticated tools from Germany, and we operated in the middle. In the end, there wasn't a middle. So the question is, do we get caught? We think we're the dominant player, but any dominant player should be asking the question of who are my real competitors? What might happen that they would win and that I would lose? Not how do I win, but what would have had to have happened if I looked back in 25 years and discovered things had gone differently than I thought. And so when you say, is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's a thing, and it's something, it's something for us to start thinking about. Maybe that's a great place to.
That's well, just one final thing on that. You said the next 25 years. Would you guys say that really, one way or the other, this is going to get sorted out in the next 25 years?
Played out.
Played out.
Sorted out implies there's a solid
There's an
answer there. It will play out.
Well, I mean that there's a bargain that becomes somewhat stable, like the Detroit Treaty, if you want, and I think that is one of the fundamental questions, and that's what John was talking when he's talking about bargains. That's what he's talking about, this treaty, and At this point, it's very difficult to say. I mean, in the United States, it's very difficult to say because our politics have become quite turbulent and unpredictable, shall we say. And I feel, you know, John talked about a national compromise. We are a nation state, but we're also a nation state that's coming apart. I mean, there are San Francisco is somewhat different from Des Moines, Iowa.
Excuse me. I'm from Omaha.
Omaha, Nebraska, right? Well, I was born in South Bend, Indiana, so you want to take a city that's...
Minneapolis.
Yeah,
so there you go. Yeah.
So I think that's the other thing that's hard to see in the United States is what kind of compromise could be developed. We spend a lot of time in the Nordic countries, in Finland. Well, you can see that they are discussing this, all of the parties of the society, and it doesn't look like anyone is trying to use the vernacular, shaft the other one. That they actually are trying to find something that is for the good of the whole society, but obviously labor has its interests and business has its interests. But I don't, so they may be able to transition because they can create a treaty, or they're continually evolving the treaty, like the Germans, that's Industry 4.0 again, right? They're continually evolving that treaty, whereas we, at this point, don't seem to be able to get everybody in the same room or in the same stadium to talk. So it may be very difficult for the United States to do this transition just because how large we are, how diverse we are. And here I'm not talking about diversity in some sort of ethnic sense. I'm talking about diversity in actually ways of thinking. Weltanschauungs from you know, Alabama, shall we say, to California to Maine. So that may be one of our difficulties
Let
also.
alone, as you've been constantly saying, it's a global economy, and even if we figured it out in the U.S. here, we're gonna figure it out with Europe, we're gonna figure it out with China. We got our work cut out for us, and I think maybe that's the place. That's the place to stop.
Thank you.
So let me just thank these two for absolutely fascinating conversation that really ranged over all kinds of themes that we will continue to explore in depth in the coming weeks and months ahead. Thanks.